Hey, welcome to another podcast of Tyrannus Hall, where we're trying to create a grace-filled space to talk about the missional mandate of the Canadian Reformed Churches. I'm Winston Bosch. I'm here with Bill DeYoung, and today we got two special guests coming to us from the other side of the country, from British Columbia, and we are talking to Len Stam and to John Zietsma, and we're talking about Pathway Christian Church in Abbotsford, British Columbia, and what they're trying to accomplish there. So everybody, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks.
Thanks for having us.
Well, let's jump right into it, guys. Tell us a little bit about Pathway Church. And well, why don't we start at the very beginning? Where did this whole idea of starting a new church originate?
So the idea started is actually about 4 years ago. There was a small group of people that, just through general discussion, the conversation was really centered around smaller church. Abbotsford Church at the time was 580 members. I think, John, it was somewhere in there. It was a pretty large congregation. And what we noticed was that people were having a little bit of difficulty actually getting a deep fellowship with the entire congregation, just because of the demographic of the congregation and the size of the congregation. So the discussion really started with small. It then kind of expanded into, an opportunity. We said, well, if there was a small congregation in Abbotsford, is there an opportunity to make a church that's threefold, equally upward, inward, and outward? And the discussion kind of went from there. So over 4 years, the idea really kind of morphed into more of an official capacity until we got to September 13th of 2020 was our institution date.
And when you say small church, are you saying that it originally started off with a desire to have a smaller church because that would be better for the people that were in it, and then that morphed into something that was more outward focused? Did it originally start with sort of a desire to say, hey, we would like to be smaller because that would be better for us?
Yeah. So we really felt the need to develop deep relationships inside of the church. I mean, especially when you read through Acts and it talks about the early church, and the sole focus of that is how the people work together on a daily basis. And so when we looked at that, we thought, I think that's a real craving that we have as a church is to develop deep relationships, to be able to pray together, to confide together. And it's not to say that you can't do that in a big church. You can, obviously, but for us, this was something that we thought was important. Abbotsford had never had a small church. Abbotsford's always been a big congregation, but also with a smaller group, if we want to have people come into the church, now it's less of an intimidation. Right? It's a smaller group of people. Perhaps you can be more welcoming. Maybe there's other things that you could do possibly. So that's kind of where the discussion went.
Right. And when you're saying we, are you talking about you and John? Are you talking about, a group of friends, some like-minded people, a small group? What are you talking about?
It started as a group of 10 people. And then it grew from 10 to 20 to 30 to 40. It grew very, very quickly. But before it got there, we went to our council. We told them, as a very small group, so the group was still 10 at the time, and we said, hey, we would like to explore this as an option. And we got their blessing to kind of gauge the rest of the congregation, and then it grew from there.
I'm kind of curious to hear from you guys whether there were any office bearers or former office bearers and that initial core group that began to brainstorm about the future of a new church.
At the time, there was 2. And our council was 26 large. And just to give you an idea, when the approval came through at classes, I believe there was 10 office bearers. But it's over 4 years, right? So there's obviously there's changeover and those things happen. But yeah, it did grow within the council. It did take time. There was a lot of discussion behind the scenes during meetings and whatnot for people to really kind of wrap their head around maybe, another church in Abbotsford, what that would look like. Again, Abbotsford has been a standalone Canadian Reformed church for many, many, many years. And a lot of the members that are there, they're charter members. right? So for them, they're kind of going, okay, well, what does this look like? What is this going to look like? But yeah, eventually we were able to present something that was palatable, that the council was very on board with it, and we had a lot of support in the end.
Let me ask you this question.
I was just wondering, Bill, why are you asking that question? What's behind your question asking about office bearers?
Oh, my own view is that it's often very hard for a group to launch an idea like that and have capital in a congregation if it doesn't have at least some who are in leadership or have been in leadership. I know of other groups where heavily populated by younger people without experience, and then it's hard for the idea to obtain traction with others. It just seems I guess a little more frivolous for individuals. But if you have some individuals in leadership who have experience being office bearers, then it automatically becomes a little more credible to people. But I want to ask a follow-up question there. So you had a group of people. Did you call yourself something? Were you a steering committee, a launch team? Did you have a name for yourselves when you went to the Abbotsford consistory and asked for endorsement or approval on your plan to launch a new congregation?
We started off with a steering committee. So we asked people to join the steering committee, and we wanted to make sure it was a well-rounded demographic, a couple office bearers on there and various ages on there, both male and female. So we were well represented in that steering committee as we explored the concept.
And then how much time did you spend meeting as a steering committee before you went and made a pitch to the congregation? Was this a matter of weeks or months or years that you were meeting before you finally reached that point where you could go public, as it were, with it?
I'm trying to remember the timeline. You know what? I actually don't think there was a lot of time from the initial meeting that we had with this very small group to going to the council itself. I actually think there was only a couple of months between that very, very first initial meeting, which took place in someone's living room, to where we were actually sitting at a council meeting. And there was many meetings after that, not only with the entire council, but we had meetings with a smaller group of council when we were trying to brainstorm ideas back and forth. So what we really wanted to focus on was that this idea was going to be cooperative, it was going to be interactive, and we were doing everything within our power to make sure it was not combative. We had sent in, at one point, it was about a 6-page document to the council, and out there we outlined the benefits of having two churches in one city and how they could work together, and how the unity aspect was going to be very important moving forward. So that was a big part of our platform with the council, was really talking about the unified aspect. So not to be combative, but to make sure that long term, that this could be a real benefit for both congregations and for the city of Abbotsford.
Yeah,
and did that idea have support with the Abbotsford leadership then? Were they on board with you? Green light, applause? How did that work in terms of the Abbotsford leadership and their relationship to you?
John, you want to take that one?
Yeah, it definitely had to work through a process. There are certain concepts that they were apprehensive with, and certain concepts that they were very excited about. Abbotsford, like Glenn said earlier, it ebbs and flows in terms of the numbers. At the high point, we were at about 580. It has a transient aspect to it because we have a university in town. The house prices in Abbotsford are through the roof. So people migrate from the west of the Fraser Valley to the east, and we're in central. There's all sorts of aspects to that. So we had to navigate some concerns and some pluses, and it was a bit of a process.
Yeah, and as a follow-up to that, a lot of the questions that we received, not only from the council, but also from members of the congregation, we were not able to answer, right? So we would get questions going, well, if you want to be a missional church, well, what does that mean exactly? What kinds of things are you guys going to be doing differently? Well, as as a steering committee and a group of people who have this idea, which is a very broad idea, it's not actually specific. There has been no planning or there's no set solid vision. We could not answer certain questions properly. And I think for certain people, they didn't know how to digest that. So what we ended up doing towards the last year is we were actually just very transparent about that. And we just said, we simply want to be a church that looks at our worship and our inward fellowship and our calling to reach the lost as three equal parts. And what that turns out to be, we'll have to see once we actually institute and we have a leadership in place that can go through a vision process, that can look at the need in Abbotsford and the needs of our congregation. And then we can get specific. But until that time comes, we just became very transparent, saying there has to be trust at a certain point, right? There has to be trust at a group of people. They want to do the right thing. They want to be genuine. And we just really want to be able to reach the lost and care for our congregation.
Yeah, that sounds really good. It sounds like you are trying to just be open, transparent, communicative, from the beginning. Let me play the devil's advocate here a little bit. What would you say to somebody who says, okay, so you want to have this sort of upward, inward, outward, three equal parts. You want to be missional. You want to be, take that seriously. Why not just work on that in Abbotsford Church? And why start a new one? Why not just change Abbotsford Church to make it more?
We had that exact question a number of times. And we took that back to the small church focus again. The contingent of people not only wanted missional, they also wanted small, so the missional is easier to do. And truly, every aspect is a bit easier to do. The upward, yes, that can be done and hopefully is done in all churches, no matter the size. The inward and the outward, I do believe there is a benefit to being a smaller congregation. And part of our growth plan would be that if we grow the church, that we'd look at splitting off again, probably sooner than later.
That whole conversation, I agree with you. I share your perspective, but I think it's an interesting conversation because there are certain things that large churches can do that smaller churches can't, just because they're able to, have a certain amount of funds or they got a broader group of people to pull from. So I don't know, Bill, you got any comments about that? Sort of the big church versus small church in terms of mission and the pros and cons that are related there?
Yeah, I think the gentlemen from Pathway have this right. Even, a missional guru like Tim Keller says that once a congregation reaches a number 200, its missional opportunities begin to diminish. And so you have to be very, very cautious as you grow. I think there are things that a large church can do to retain its missional momentum, and small groups is a key dimension of that, where you have within the larger congregation smaller families where you can have intimate fellowship that's often missing in a larger church. A larger church also has resources, of course, not available to a smaller church. I think there's another way through this, and that would be to multiply churches. So I think the idea of Pathway is a good one. We're not going to grow too big, but we're going to multiply churches. But then when you multiply churches, it's good to remain in a network of sorts where you can pool resources and basically enjoy the benefits of a large congregation, resources shared across multiple congregations, and have the perks of a smaller congregation because the congregations themselves will not be that large.
Well, hey, let's talk now about, Pathway Church does it get instituted? Does it get, right off the bat, I think you mentioned 2000 and I forget the date as to, and now it starts. So what does that look like? Does that mean that you already have office bearers in place? Have you, instituted officially? What does that look like?
So we instituted September 13th, 2020, thinking that maybe COVID wouldn't be going on for as long as it has. But we had office bearers right away. We installed office bearers right away on that date. And since then, it's been a lot of planning, a lot of vision meetings. Typically we've heard from other churches that they'll do, like a yearly vision planning or vision meeting session. I think we've had 5 by now. And what we wanted to do was to look at the size of our church, and then care groups as the integral focus of care. And then outside of that, to look at the role of the elder and the deacon. And we looked at it in the traditional sense. We looked at scripture, and we wanted to look at what scripture said about those roles. And then we were trying to basically implement the roles into essentially a flow chart of Pathway Church, to go, who is responsible where, who's responsible for general care. And we've been expanding on that now for the last, I would say, six months, where we've just completed it. So, and it was an amazing process. It really was. It brought out discussions that honestly we've never had as part of a church body, to really be intentional and to go in really deep on how each member plays a role into church life. So not as just a passenger, but as a driver, right? What is the responsibility of each member of the church, and how is the church leadership going to help them fulfill what their mandate is as a disciple?
And who's having these discussions? Because both of you are office bearers at Pathway. Who else is involved in these discussions? Is this the council? Is this anybody else?
So far, it's just been the council. We've actually had a member of our congregation who's been helping us, who's had a lot of leadership training. So we went through actually a very systematic process, but so far it's been the council, and then we'll be rolling that out to our congregation shortly. I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that, John.
No, that was the process. And as we go along and develop it, more people will be brought in. I think a key part of that too will be the care group leaders determining how this rolls out into the congregation and into the life of our people. So
tell me this then. What's the planning that you're doing? What would be the big differences between what you're hoping to do or how you're hoping to set things up, and the way that a traditional Canadian Reformed church would run? What would be the big difference?
I think one of the things that you get in a bigger, more traditional church is you might get a little bit lost on the discipleship aspect. There was a book, one of the many books that we turned to for a bit of insight, was The Trellis and the Vine. So we wanted to focus on building the vine and less on the trellis again. And that is going to be a key component going forward. Having disciples making disciples, and making gospel part of everyone's lives, and making it meaningful, like the gospel in the corners of everyone's life, right? And not just down center ice.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that, John. My brother Everett, whom you know, has used a similar analogy, that in his previous experiences as an elder, there was a lot of attention paid to the fence and not a lot of attention paid to the sheep. And shepherds should be busy with the sheep. And so that's a very good trajectory. I wonder if you could just share with us what the sentiment is within your congregation. I imagine that you launched with some excitement. Do you still discern that excitement in your members? This is, of course, such an unusual time, and you launched in the thick of COVID, but do you still discern from within your congregation a lot of excitement about this new church?
That's actually where it gets tricky. So we've been an instituted church for 8 months, and we've never met with all of us, with all 180 members, right? So it's hard to judge the pulse of the entire church. We've had a lot of participation in our Zoom congregational meetings. We've had outstanding participation in the process of calling a minister. We've had tremendous participation and help doing the online services. So in that sense, there is a lot of activity and excitement going on. We'll soon find out when we present the vision of the church. Again, it has to be in a Zoom congregational meeting. We'll see what the feedback is on that, if the excitement is continuing. It is difficult when you're not meeting all together. Even our institution took place in 3 locations. One where the live streaming in the institution and the ordination of the office bearers took place, and 2 satellite locations where they got to watch us on the screen and participate that way. So yeah, odd times.
Yeah, I appreciate your answer, John. It was perhaps a little unfair because people ask me at times how I ascertain the health of Blessings, and my most frequent answer is I don't even really know how Blessings is doing, just because, like you, we haven't had opportunities to have the congregation together very much, and so there are a lot of big question marks in my mind. You mentioned the Trellis and the Vine as a resource that has inspired you in many ways. Have you found other books, other resources that have helped you kind of shape your understanding of the vision and mission of the church?
I think probably each one of us on the leadership team approaches that different. Len, for instance, seems to have a nice little network of people that he's constantly consulting with, including Hilmer and Bill. Early on, we reached out to you as well. So we do have a network of people. There's some readers in the group as well. I personally been dabbling with a book, The Vocation of the Church. It's Mike Goheen's exposition of Leslie Newbigin's work. So that has some interesting aspects to it. And then we come together and we bring together our thoughts and ideas on various subjects, and we move on from there.
And are your care groups functioning already? Are they meeting over Zoom, or don't you have care groups established quite yet?
We do have established, and if I'd have to admit, that's something that in retrospect we would have done different. So we get up and running, we're not able to meet together, we focus on being able to live stream with ever-changing parameters from the health authorities. We focus on how do we call a minister and the vision of the congregation, and really giving that adequate push to care groups has lagged. And that's on us as leadership. And we're trying to rectify that currently. And very shortly, we're going to run a couple training sessions and try to get something going. Having said that, we have a bunch of good members. So people have been active, just not specifically in the form of care groups. And some care groups have been more than others, but we want definitely a more consistent approach across the board.
I think, to be fair to that point, though, what we wanted to do was we wanted to roll out training. And so John and Al Boovy had spent a bunch of time looking through different resources for care group training. And we had a plan. And the plan was to get the care group leaders together in a building and spend a couple nights. And then the health authority moved the goalposts on us. So then training got delayed. And so unfortunately, it's just something that's just kind of been kicked down the road as we, okay, new change. Now we can only be in a room with 10 people. Oh, now we can't do that anymore. So unfortunately, the result of that is that the care groups were not launched the way that we really wanted them to go. So like John said, we'll have to kind of go back, reset that, and not start over, but make sure that we start fresh with proper training. That is a very, very important aspect to what Pathway or to who Pathway is as a church. And it's going to be very, very integral that we get it right. And we understand how important that is. So.
And because we wanted to get it right, we felt it very important to have that face-to-face training, to have everyone in a room to be able to discuss openly. And then, yeah, like Len said earlier, this COVID thing has taken a bit longer than everyone figured. So we may be forced to look at the way we didn't want to do things.
Yeah, I'm sure that when you guys, on your 25th church anniversary, someone's going to stand up and tell the story about how it was the most ridiculous church launch ever in the middle of COVID.
Yeah.
rather than dwelling on, what could have been because of COVID. Tell us a little bit more about this idea of creating this vision and mission statement or vision and mission document. Do you guys have, for instance, a mission statement that you're proposing to your congregation? Do you have that? Do you think that's important?
Well, we do. We have a few different things, and I mean, really, when we went through the vision process, what we wanted to establish was who we are, and how are we going to be different. So what's our niche, and then thirdly, what does that actually mean to the members of the congregation, right? It's one thing to say, hey, we're an organization, this is who we stand for. People go, oh, that's great, but it has to mean something to the members, right? The members have to buy into the concept. So we spent a lot of time going, okay, if we're members of this church, who do we want to be for our members, and who can we be for our community? So for example, we went through a few drafts and just looking at them here. And, so one of the things that we said was we want to be all in. We don't want to be half measures. We want to be all in as a church. So not just as church leadership, but as members of the church. We want to be united together, committed to the church, be generous, passionately committed to putting others first, right? So that would be one aspect. We want to be disciples. Right. Obviously, we want to be disciples, and that's not only in the missional sense, but that's also in the inward sense, right? People that are struggling, how can we disciple one another? John's been a huge voice when it's come to discipling one another, and that's going to be a constant thing moving forward with the care groups, and that'll be part of the training there. Thirdly, we want to be courageous. Right. And we hope that every member of Pathway Church, that they go, yeah, I want to be courageous, right? So what does that look like? Well, we want to maintain a focus on exploring the truths of the Bible, our calling to spread the good news of Jesus, to be at the center of everything that we do. And then lastly, to be compassionate, to serve everyone in the community with love and respect, and to show genuine concern for those who are suffering. So that's one aspect of our vision process that we went through to come to those four points as a rollout to our congregation. So, and that's not just for the leadership, as I said before, that's for the members, that's for all of Pathway as an identity.
Okay, so I'm gonna play the devil's advocate again. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
So you've got someone listening to this, and they're like, "What are they? Why compassionate, courageous? All those things are good, but why don't you just say we're reformed? We're a reformed church. We're aiming for the marks of a true church. That's who we are." And that, of course, includes all those other things. So why spend all this time doing a mission statement? How would you respond to something like that? Someone who's not doing that flippantly, but is being genuine in what they're saying.
I'll start, John, and you can help me out here. I think it's important that we be very careful how we answer this question, because for myself personally, this is something that I think most Reformed people feel very, very strongly about, either in one sense or another. But the term Reformed in the greater community, and this is just my opinion, I don't think it means too much. The term Christian means far more. The term community means far more. And so what we wanted to do, and that's in our name as well. And that's not to say that we reject our Canadian Reformed base of belief. Absolutely not. But what we wanted to be able to do, we didn't want to start with the wrong conversation for people to go, so you're Reformed, what does that mean? Well, that's not the conversation that we want to have. We want to have a conversation about Christ, about Christian living, and to be able to direct in that way. So again, I want to be careful with that. It's actually, to me, it's not a discussion about being Reformed. It's just about being Christian as a focus, and who we are as a church, our preaching, our beliefs. That's Reformed. We have Reformed theology in our church. That is not going to change. but as an identity to people who are unchurched, the word reformed is just, it's a word that they probably won't understand it.
And the other thing I think is what the process allows you to do is reflect, right? Anytime you throw out something like a mission statement or a whole vision statement to a congregation's got to think about every aspect of it. And you may not do anything different, but see it totally new and be motivated by it in a totally different way. Because at the end of the day, your mission, your vision is going to be gospel centered. So everything will get drawn back to gospel and who we are in Jesus Christ and what our calling is in the world. And if you point all the traditions which we have for years and years and years, and you relook at them and in a new light, point them towards the gospel, hopefully you're seeing the gospel all over again, right? Even though we've been immersed in it for years.
Yeah, I think there's really something unique about a church going through the process of vision crafting and mission planning. It's different than that exercise being conducted by a corporation, because often a corporation just asks itself questions. But as Christians, we envision something for the church, but of course we want to bring God's vision in Scripture into our own vision statement. So it's not just about a commodity that we want to produce or market. It's about aligning ourselves with the mission of Christ. And in that regard, it just has to be gospel centered. And I think there's a lot of value in a church having a vision statement that's clear and memorable. Ideally, you want a vision statement that everyone in your congregation can reproduce when asked, because people value integrity, but they follow clarity. And I think that's one of the ways in which you either change a church culture or keep a healthy church by retaining that vision. And being gospel centered is so important. And you might say, well, that's assumed in a church. And yet I think we can all think of church cultures where the gospel is not nearly as central as it ought to be. And so it's a good way of keeping that important focus point central. The other thing that I would say is that in our model of church leadership, we have term elders. And so there's a rotation of men going in and out of office. And in each scenario, you're going to have people who think a little bit differently. But it's so great for a leadership to identify something in common and say, we're going to keep pursuing this and keep doing this regardless of who is sitting around this table, after the changing of the guard, so to speak. So I don't know that vision crafting and mission planning is necessary for a church. I do think it's something that's very helpful for the church, and I think we ought to pursue those exercises that are helpful for the church.
Yeah, I think that's well put, Bill, that it's not necessary, but helpful. And John, when you say that just going through that whole process is sort of refreshing and it helps you to see with new eyes, perhaps some of the things that you've missed. Oh, I 100% agree with you. I think in a lot of ways, trying to intentionally make your church more mission focused is just a return to the three forms of unity and to the history of the Reformed Church back in the time of the Reformation. It's really not inventing anything new. It's really going back to your roots. But the key word is intentional. It's to make sure that it's actually being done. And so in some sense, doing that whole process, that vision or mission planning is a bit of a corrective to saying, hey, there's something that perhaps we've missed out or we've not been as strong in as we could have been. And so we want to take this process and really slow down and take our time to work our ways through that so that perhaps we can correct things and we can be more intentionally reformed as we want to be and as our historical forefathers have thought in the past. So yeah, I think that's wonderful.
It's interesting that you mentioned before just simply about when there's the changing of the guard. And we've talked about this a few times, where you go, okay, so we have all these great thoughts and all these great ideas that we want to do. But what happens in 5 years when you have guys sitting here who are not part of any of these discussions, these extremely important discussions, because those discussions form what the basis of your church's ministry is. How can you keep that going throughout the years? So we established an accountability flow chart. That's the start of it. And what it does is it clearly identifies who is responsible for what, where the consistory, and where does discipleship fit in that? And on the deacon side with the caring, well, what are the deacons actually responsible for? Is it just money, or what is that? So we've identified that. So it's that the deacons play a bigger role. So in the traditional sense, when you look at a deacon, you go, they collect the money and they disperse it to those in need. Yes, they do. But they also care for people. They are there to visit the sick. And there's many other examples where they can get involved and they can do more things to assist the elders. And quite honestly, I think there's a lot of things that elders do which they shouldn't be doing. We get caught in these administrative traps and we think that, well, that's got to go to the council. That's their job. No, it's probably not. But because for so long we've done things in a certain way where we feel that, like, the buck stops somewhere, and that usually stops at the top with the council that has to make all these decisions. We've kind of taken a step back from all of that, and we wanted to be very realistic in our approach. We also really wanted to empower people within Pathway. When we look at our committee of administration, are we empowering them, or are we just saying to them, well, here's a task that we're giving you, and when you're done it, let us know so that we can look at it and then we can rubber stamp it and make sure that the work you're doing is good enough. There's a culture with that too, right? So anyways, we could go on about this for a really long time, but that's a big aspect to what we're doing, is empowering the members within our church.
I'd like to ask you this question. It may be premature because we're still in a pandemic. You've not been up and running for very long, but what opportunities do you see in Abbotsford? I know a little bit about Abbotsford. You mentioned the university. I think there are a couple of institutions of higher learning in the vicinity. Have you identified yet specific missional opportunities that you believe Pathway might have, especially post-pandemic?
Not really. That is one of the things that hasn't been brought up. We do know one thing within Abbotsford. There's a lot of partnerships to be had. They often call Abbotsford the Bible Belt of Canada. And there's a lot of churches doing a lot of good work, both in the city and worldwide. So like you gentlemen said earlier, you have to take advantage of the partnerships that you can form and the resources that they have.
So that in itself kind of augments and supports the promotion of the gospel, because people are not fond of seeing churches operate as silos or as rivals to other churches. And it gives the Christian message more plausibility and credibility if they see churches and organizations collaborating. So even that is something missional, to work together with others. That was my point.
Let me ask this question, gentlemen. What about what you hope Sundays to look like? When people roll up at Pathway Church, will it seem very familiar to them if they come from a Canadian Reformed background? Will it seem different? What will that look like?
It's a really good question. I would imagine for the most part, yes, it would be very familiar. I think how we imagine it is that it would be hopefully buzzing with activity and a lot of fellowship, the same way that you would see through any Canadian Reformed church and quite honestly, most churches around Canada, around the world on a Sunday. Our liturgy would be fairly similar. We've already started implementing some, one gathering song. We'll probably multiply that. But I think for the most part, it would be fairly similar. The only difference would be is that, like, we rent a building, we won't have an organ. We're going to use multiple instruments. Some churches are already obviously doing that, some aren't. But for the most part, yeah, I think it would be fairly familiar to most people that would come from across Canada and attend another Canadian Reformed church.
Yeah, that's great, guys. I imagine it would be good to have this conversation again in 1 year's time and see, we could have an update to see how things are going. Maybe we can finish with this. Can you give some words of advice to any other people that are in a current congregation who are saying, hey, I would love to be, if we could, perhaps do something like Pathway is doing. We've got a large church. Perhaps we could branch out and do something similar. You got any words of advice or words of encouragement for people who might be thinking along those lines?
I would say, don't try to be somebody else. If you want to do this, get together collectively, have a genuine idea. If you don't have all the answers, that's fine. But don't try to use another church as a barometer of what your goals are. Because what it does is if people have a perception of something, whether right or wrong, then they go, that's what they're going to go do. Well, that's not necessarily true. But if you set that expectation, then you are setting yourself up for that. So again, be genuine. Don't be afraid to not have the answers. Speak your heart and pray and pray and pray. That's if it, and it's not saying that we didn't do that, but we definitely made some mistakes off the get-go by saying, here's some of the things that we would like to do. Here's what some other churches are doing. And I think people found it a little confusing.
Yeah. And I would echo those comments by Len. And a big thing with identifying who you are is using the skill set you have within your congregation. So if you're trying to look like another church, but you don't have the skill set within your congregation to make that happen, you're going to fail, right? So you want to do a lot of self-reflecting too on what you have within your congregation, and obviously the discussions of where you want to go. So that'd be our advice, I think.
Yeah. Well, thank you very, very much. God bless you both as office bearers at Pathway Christian Church, and God bless your church. And we do sincerely hope that we'll be able to perhaps speak to you again in the future and get an update on what's happening. I'm hoping that this conversation will have encouraged our Canadian Reformed listeners who might be thinking along similar lines. Gentlemen, thanks so much for being on the podcast today. So, Bill, we recorded this conversation with our brothers from Pathway in late April. And at this point in time, both your church, Blessings, and Pathway Church have called the same URC pastor, Phil Grotenhuis. So who do you think's going to win?
Oh, really? I don't know. I do not want to make a prediction. I will say this, that if Phil Grotenhuis goes to Pathway, I will celebrate and praise the Lord. And it will be a very good thing, though, of course, in my own heart, I hope and wish that Phil ends up at Blessings.
So, there's been lots of Canadian Reformed churches that have gotten to a certain size and then they've split because their numbers were too big and they decided to, let's create two churches in two different geographical areas. Pathway Church started out as a desire to say, hey, let's make something smaller. And perhaps that is similar to the way that churches have split in the past to create two congregations. But then it brought on this other character of saying, we want to be a church that is involved in worship and care for our members, but also outreach in an equal way. That's really encouraging for me. I think that's fantastic. And I hope there's going to be, more, we're going to see more of that in the future as people think, yeah, it's not just about our church is too big, but we also need to be thinking whenever we're starting a new church about how can we be reaching our community, in the best way that we can.
Yeah, I think that you understood that correctly. It seems that the initial impetus behind Pathway was simply a smaller congregation. And that, of course, is commendable. We've talked before about how a missional church is just a healthy church, and a healthy church is a church in which people are intimately familiar with the needs and the joys of each other. But I think you're right. I think that over time, as the leadership thought more about this, their focus shifted from simply small congregation to missional congregation. And it sounds like they've done a lot of work, a lot of reading, a lot of thinking, a lot of reflection, a lot of conversation about how best to do that. And I appreciated the humility of the gentlemen, recognizing that they don't have all the questions answered, but they're prodding along and trying before the face of the Lord to do their best.
And part of that humility comes out in a desire to make sure you don't burn bridges with your home church or your mother church, that you get buy-in from the council of the church that you're moving out of from. I really appreciated that. We don't want to start missional churches or churches that are more intentionally missional in ways that burn bridges or help, or that fracture the unity of the church. I think that's super important. If we can have, groups of people saying, hey, we want to start something new over here, but we're doing it in a way that demonstrates respect and love for everybody, including the people that we're perhaps leaving behind in our mother church, that seems to me that's essential.
Well, let me question you on that. I think it's very commendable, and I think the Pathway story is a wonderful story for this group to have the blessing of the mother church, if you will. But what do you recommend for a group of people who want to launch a missional church, who are doing so with integrity, who want to see the gospel brought to those who don't know Jesus in the community, and they're receiving pushback from the leadership of their own particular church? Does that mean that they necessarily must abort that plan? So I'm pushing back a little bit on it is essential. That's the word you use, to have the support of your leadership. Could you ever conceive of a scenario where a group still decides to launch even without the support of the leadership of one's church? Or would you say that in that scenario, why not to do such a thing?
Yeah, that's a good pushback. I got to be careful with my terms. I think what is essential is that you are approaching the whole process with integrity, with humility, that you're listening well to perhaps to the pushback or to the objections of others, that you're using all the available means that you have at your disposal to really understand what arguments might be against you. You've got church visitors, you've got, different ways to really understand, are we on a wayward path? Are we trying to do something that's not right? But if you take that humble approach and you use all those avenues that are available to you, and you get to the conclusion that indeed we're trying to do something that's obedient to God, obedient to Scripture, and we're trying to do something in a good way to reach our neighbors for Christ, and then yet we're receiving no or a pushback from our local church, then no, I wouldn't say that you should just therefore stop. That would be a very unfortunate situation. Ideally, you ought to strive for starting a new congregation, but maintaining the unity of the bonded churches in the best way that you can.
Yeah, I think that's a very good rejoinder, following due process. And I think that in a scenario where you meet resistance from your own church leadership, there is recourse, as you indicated, perhaps with church visitors, bringing in more individuals to speak into the situation. But I certainly believe that this is the best approach. Groups who want to launch new churches that are missional in nature ought to engage their leadership and ideally obtain their blessing and prayerful support before they launch.
All right. Thanks so much, Bill. We'll have to wait and see where Pastor Phil ends up going, whether he goes to Pathway or Blessings. And I'm sure we'll praise God either way.
You're not going to make a prediction now, are you? Or
not at all. I'm signing off here.
All right. Well, that was a great discussion with those two gentlemen from Pathway, and great to see you again today, Winston.
All right. See you later.